"I've never been with a woman," confessed the isolated farmer to the widow knocking on his door. He lived in solitude, speaking only to his sheep and the wind. But she arrived in the storm, demanding shelter and offering no apologies. Their alliance challenged norms, unlocking something neither dared to name. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching us from. We continue. I promise that this will be the best story you will hear in your life. The Montana sky darkened as storm clouds gathered over the vast plains, turning the late afternoon into premature dusk. Sarah Matthews pulled her worn denim jacket tighter around her shoulders and urged her exhausted horse forward. The animal had been traveling for hours, and like its rider, showed signs of weariness that couldn't be ignored much longer. "Just a little further. Duke," she murmured, patting the horse's neck as thunder rumbled in the distance. "We need to find shelter before this storm hits." At 42, Sarah carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had weathered her share of life's storms. Her husband's passing 3 years ago had left her with nothing but debts and memories. After settling what she could and selling their small Nebraska home, she had decided to start fresh in Montana, where land was more affordable and where no one knew her story. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall as she spotted a light in the distance, a farmhouse. Set back from the road with a modest barn nearby, Sarah hesitated. Strangers weren't always welcoming in these remote parts, but the darkening sky and increasingly heavy rainfall left her with little choice. As she approached, she could make out a small sheep ranch, not prosperous by any means, but well-maintained. The rain was falling in sheets now, and Duke was struggling against the wind. Sarah dismounted near the covered porch and knocked firmly on the door. Long moments passed before it creaked open. A man stood in the doorway, tall and lean, with the weathered face of someone who spent his days outdoors. His expression registered surprise, then caution. "I'm sorry to disturb you," Sarah said, raising her voice over the howl of the wind. "My horse and I got caught in the storm. I was hoping we could take shelter in your barn until it passes." The man, somewhere in his late 40s, she guessed, studied her for a moment. His gaze was direct but not unkind. "Storm's too severe to wait out in the barn," he finally said, his voice rough from disuse. "You'd better come inside. I can stable your horse." Relief washed over Sarah. "Thank you. I'm Sarah Matthews." "Ethan Cole," he replied simply, grabbing a heavy coat from a hook by the door. They worked together in silence to settle Duke in the barn. Sarah noticed how Ethan moved with quiet efficiency, his hands gentle with the tired animal. Once Duke was fed and comfortable, they hurried back to the house, now thoroughly soaked despite their brief time in the downpour. Inside, the farmhouse was sparsely furnished but clean and warm. A wood stove glowed in the corner of the main room, which served as both kitchen and living area. "I can make some coffee," Ethan offered, moving to the stove. "Please, let me," Sarah replied. "It's the least I can do." He seemed momentarily taken aback, but nodded and pointed to a tin on the shelf. As Sarah went about preparing the coffee, she became aware of Ethan watching her, a puzzled expression on his face. "Are you traveling alone?" he asked finally. "Yes," she answered. "I'm headed to Clearwater Valley. I bought a small piece of land there, sight unseen. Not the wisest decision, perhaps, but it was what I could afford." Ethan nodded. "Clearwater's still 50 miles northwest. Roads will be washed out by now." The implication hung in the air between them. Sarah would need to stay the night. As if reading her thoughts, Ethan said, "You can take the bed. I'll sleep in the chair." "I couldn't possibly—" "I insist," he cut in, then added more softly, "It's no trouble." There was an awkward silence as they sipped their coffee. Sarah noticed calluses on Ethan's hands, the kind that came from years of physical labor. His home contained no photographs, no personal touches beyond the essentials. "Have you lived here long?" she asked. "All my life," he replied. "Inherited it from my father. It's a nice place." He gave a slight shrug. "It's modest, but it's mine. The sheep provide enough to get by." Another silence fell between them, but strangely it wasn't uncomfortable. There was something restful about Ethan's quiet presence, so different from the constant need to fill silence that characterized most interactions. As the evening progressed, Sarah offered to prepare dinner from the supplies in Ethan's kitchen. Again, he seemed surprised by the offer, but accepted with a nod. They ate a simple meal of beans and cornbread. And Sarah noticed that Ethan ate methodically, like a man who viewed food as fuel rather than pleasure. "I never had a woman here before," he said suddenly, then looked embarrassed at his own words. "I mean, I've never been married, or had much company at all." Sarah was surprised by his candor. "It must get lonely sometimes." "You get used to it," he said. Then, after a pause, "Though I'm not sure that's a good thing." There was a vulnerability in his admission that touched Sarah. She recognized in Ethan a kind of isolation that went beyond physical remoteness, a man who had grown so accustomed to solitude that he'd forgotten there could be alternatives. Later, as the storm continued to rage outside, Ethan showed Sarah to his bedroom, a Spartan space with a handmade quilt on the bed and a single lamp on a wooden crate that served as a nightstand. "I put fresh sheets on," he said, hovering awkwardly in the doorway. "Thank you, Ethan, for everything." He nodded, then hesitated as if wanting to say more but thinking better of it. "Good night, Sarah." "Good night." Sarah sat on the edge of the bed after he left, listening to the rain lashing against the windows. There was something both comforting and strange about being in this unfamiliar house, with this unfamiliar man just beyond the door. For the first time in years, she felt a curious sense of possibility, as if the storm had blown her not just off course, but perhaps exactly where she needed to be. Sleep came easier than she expected, lulled by the rhythm of the rain and the knowledge that, at least for tonight, she didn't have to face the world alone. Morning arrived with unexpected brightness, the storm having blown itself out during the night. Sarah woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of movement in the kitchen. She dressed quickly and found Ethan at the stove, frying eggs. "Roads should be passable by noon," he said by way of greeting. "Yes, I suppose they will be," Sarah replied, feeling a strange reluctance at the thought of continuing her journey. As they ate breakfast, Sarah made an impulsive decision. "Ethan, I notice your place could use some organizing, and I'm good with numbers if you need help with accounts. I could stay a few days and help out in exchange for the shelter. Before I continue to Clearwater." Ethan looked up, surprise evident in his eyes. For a moment, Sarah thought he would refuse. Then a small, cautious smile transformed his features. "I'd like that," he said simply. And with those 3 words, something shifted between them, a door opening to a future neither had anticipated when the storm began. The days stretched into weeks as Sarah and Ethan fell into an unexpected rhythm together. What had begun as a temporary arrangement gradually evolved into something neither had planned for, but both had come to rely on. The small ranch transformed under Sarah's practical touch, kitchen cupboards reorganized, financial records sorted, and a vegetable garden started behind the house. Ethan, initially awkward around her constant presence, slowly began to open up. In the evenings, after the day's work was done, they would sit on the porch and talk. At first, the conversations were practical, about the sheep, the weather, the repairs needed around the property. But gradually they began sharing fragments of their lives. "I was married for 15 years, Sarah told him one evening, as they watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "Tom was a good man, but he was always chasing the next opportunity, always certain the big break was just around the corner." Ethan listened quietly, his eyes on the horizon. "When he passed, I discovered we were deeply in debt. The dreams he'd been chasing had costs I never knew about," she sighed. "It took everything I had to clear his name and settle with the creditors. That couldn't have been easy," Ethan said softly. Sarah smiled sadly. "It wasn't, but it taught me something important about standing on my own feet, making my own decisions." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "I've been standing on my own feet too long, I think. My father was the same way, kept to himself, barely spoke to the neighbors. I followed his example without questioning it. The admission seemed to cost him something, and Sarah recognized it as a gift, a piece of himself he wasn't accustomed to sharing. Their partnership was founded on practical terms. Sarah managed the household and finances, while Ethan handled the sheep and physical labor of the ranch. But they established ground rules that respected each other's autonomy, decisions made together, workloads shared equitably, and space given when needed. One afternoon, Sarah found Ethan struggling with a broken fence in the back pasture. Without a word, she picked up tools and began working alongside him. "You don't have to do this," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "I know," she replied simply. I want to. They worked side by side until the fence was mended, the physical labor creating a different kind of bond between them, one built on shared purpose rather than mere convenience. That evening, as Sarah prepared dinner, Ethan came in from checking on a pregnant ewe. He stood in the doorway watching her move around his kitchen, a kitchen that somehow no longer felt like just his. "I've been thinking," he said hesitantly. "Your land in Clearwater, have you seen it yet?" Sarah shook her head. "No, as I said, I bought it sight unseen. Maybe we should go take a look. Tomorrow if the weather holds." Sarah turned to face him, surprised by the suggestion. "You'd go with me?" He nodded. "If you'd like the company." The journey to Clearwater Valley the next day revealed more than just Sarah's property. The parcel of land she had purchased turned out to be rocky and steep, challenging terrain that would require significant investment to make workable. "It's not what I expected," she admitted as they stood surveying the 5 acres she now owned. Ethan studied the land thoughtfully. "It has potential," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "The view is nice," Sarah laughed despite her disappointment. "The view won't feed me or provide income." They were quiet for a moment, both contemplating the reality of what lay before them. "You know," Ethan said finally, "my place isn't much, but there's room for expansion. With proper management, we could increase the flock, maybe diversify a bit." Sarah looked at him, understanding the unspoken invitation. "Are you suggesting a business partnership?" "Maybe more than that," he said quietly, his eyes meeting hers directly for perhaps the first time since they'd met. "I've grown used to having you around, Sarah, more than used to it. I'd like you to stay, permanently if you want." The proposal, practical as it was, contained an emotional undercurrent that Sarah couldn't ignore. This wasn't a romantic declaration, but it was honest and in some ways more meaningful than flowery words could have been. "I'd need to think about it," she said carefully. "Of course," he replied, stepping back slightly. "No pressure. It's just an option." The drive back to the ranch was quiet, both lost in their own thoughts. For Sarah, the decision wasn't simple. Staying with Ethan meant giving up the independence she had fought so hard to reclaim after her husband's passing. Yet she had come to care for this quiet, steadfast man and the life they were building together. That night, unable to sleep, Sarah stepped outside to clear her head. The Montana sky spread above her, a vast canopy of stars unclouded by city lights. She heard the door open behind her and knew without turning that Ethan had joined her. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked. "No." He stood beside her, both of them looking up at the night sky. "I'm sorry if I made things awkward earlier." "You didn't," she assured him. "It's a big decision, that's all." "For both of us," he acknowledged. "I've been alone a long time, Sarah. I don't know if I'd be any good at not being alone." There was such honesty in his confession that Sarah felt something shift inside her. "Maybe we could learn together," she said softly. A sudden gust of wind made her shiver, and without thinking, Ethan put his arm around her shoulders. The gesture was protective rather than possessive, and Sarah found herself leaning into his warmth. "I think I'd like to stay," she said, the words emerging with surprising certainty. "Not because I don't have other options, but because this feels right." Ethan's arm tightened slightly around her. "I'm glad," he said simply. They formalized their arrangement the following week, not with a traditional wedding, but with a simple ceremony officiated by a justice of the peace in the nearest town. There were no guests, no elaborate celebration, just 2 people committing to build a life together on terms that honored both their needs. Sarah sold her Clearwater land and invested the money in their shared enterprise. With her business acumen and Ethan's agricultural knowledge, they began expanding operations, adding pigs to provide a more consistent cash flow and reducing their dependence on the seasonal income from sheep. The physical intimacy between them developed gradually, as naturally as their working relationship had. Ethan was inexperienced but gentle, and Sarah found in his arms a tenderness she hadn't expected. Their relationship, founded on mutual respect and practical compatibility, blossomed into something deeper, a love built on solid ground rather than fleeting passion. As summer turned to fall, the ranch began to show signs of their joint efforts. The barn was repaired, the flock healthier and more numerous, the garden yielding a bountiful harvest. Ethan, encouraged by Sarah, began attending community meetings in town, finding his voice in civic matters after years of isolation. "You've changed him," commented Eleanor Williams, the owner of the general store. When Sarah came in for supplies, Ethan Cole used to barely speak 2 words when he came to town. Now he's volunteering for the county fair committee. Sarah smiled. He's changing himself. He just needed someone to believe he could. As she drove home that afternoon, Sarah felt a contentment she hadn't experienced in years. The future stretched before them, full of possibility. Neither of them could have predicted the storm that had brought them together, nor the challenges that still lay ahead. But for now, the foundation they had built seemed strong enough to weather whatever came next. Winter settled over the ranch, blanketing the land in pristine white. Inside the farmhouse, warmth prevailed, not just from the crackling wood stove, but from the home Sarah and Ethan had created together. The holiday season approached, and for the first time in years, Ethan had agreed to put up a modest Christmas tree. "My father always said decorations were frivolous," he explained, as they hung simple ornaments on the small pine they'd cut from their own land. Sarah reached up to place a handmade star on top. "And what do you think?" Ethan considered for a moment. "I think I like seeing this place through your eyes. It feels more like a home now." The tender moment was interrupted by the sound of a vehicle coming up the long driveway, unusual for this remote location, especially in winter. Ethan moved to the window, his expression shifting to one of confusion. "It's a fancy SUV," he said. "Don't recognize it." Sarah joined him at the window, and as the vehicle came closer, a chill that had nothing to do with the December air ran through her. She recognized the silver Cadillac Escalade instantly. It belonged to Richard Harrington, her late husband's former business partner. "Sarah." Ethan noticed her reaction. "Do you know who that is?" "Yes," she replied, her voice tight. "It's someone from my past. Someone I never expected to see again." The Escalade came to a stop and 2 men emerged. Richard, impeccably dressed in an expensive overcoat, and beside him, a younger man carrying a leather briefcase. "Stay calm," Sarah whispered, more to herself than to Ethan. "Let me handle this." Ethan nodded, though his posture had tensed. They went to the door together, presenting a united front as their unexpected visitors approached. "Sarah Matthews," Richard called out, his smile not reaching his cold eyes. "What a surprise to find you all the way out here in the middle of nowhere." "It's Sarah Cole now," she corrected him. "What brings you to Montana, Richard?" "Business, my dear." "Always business?" He gestured to the man beside him. "This is Andrew Parker, my attorney. May we come in? It's rather chilly out here." Reluctantly, Sarah and Ethan invited them inside. The contrast was stark. Richard and his attorney in their city clothes, looking out of place in the rustic farmhouse. "Quite the change from your life in Nebraska," Richard commented, glancing around the room with barely disguised disdain. "I almost didn't believe it when I heard you'd remarried and moved to a sheep ranch. How did you find me?" Sarah asked directly. Richard waved a hand dismissively. "Small world, Sarah. I was in Billings for a land development project, ran into someone who knew someone. You know how it goes." The explanation was vague enough to be concerning. Sarah had been careful to make a clean break from her past. "What do you want, Richard?" she asked, cutting to the chase. Richard nodded to his attorney, who opened his briefcase and removed several documents. "I'm afraid this isn't a social call. We're here about some unfinished business between you and Tom's estate." Ethan moved closer to Sarah, his presence steady and reassuring. "What unfinished business?" Sarah asked. "I settled all of Tom's debts. There was nothing left." Richard's smile turned predatory. "Not quite all. There was a private loan agreement between Tom and me. Quite substantial, actually. With interest, it comes to just over $150,000. The number hit Sarah like a physical blow. "That's impossible. I went through all of Tom's papers, all his accounts." "This was a gentleman's agreement," Richard explained smoothly. "But fortunately, we did put it in writing." He nodded to the attorney, who slid a document across the table. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she picked up the paper. It appeared to be a loan agreement for $75,000, dated 6 months before Tom's passing, with his signature at the bottom. "I've never seen this before," she said, studying the document carefully. Something about it felt wrong, though she couldn't immediately identify. "What?" Nevertheless, it's valid, the attorney interjected. And as Tom's widow, you inherited his debts along with his assets. There were no assets, Sarah reminded them sharply. Richard leaned forward. Which puts us in a difficult position. However, I'm not unreasonable. We could work out a payment plan, or... He paused, eyes scanning the room again. Perhaps an arrangement involving this property. Ethan, who had been silent until now, spoke up. This property has nothing to do with Sarah's previous marriage. It's mine. It's been in my family for generations. Richard raised an eyebrow. But now that you're married, things get complicated legally. Community property and all that. Montana is not a community property state, Sarah countered, her years of managing finances giving her confidence. And even if it were, this debt, if it even exists, predates our marriage. The attorney cleared his throat. Regardless, Mrs. Cole, the debt is substantial and legitimate. We're prepared to file a lawsuit if necessary, which would likely result in a lien against any property you have an interest in. The threat hung in the air. Sarah and Ethan exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. We'll need time to review this, Sarah said finally. And to consult our own attorney. Richard checked his watch. Of course. Take a week. We're staying in Billings until Friday. He stood, signaling the end of the conversation. Do consider settling this amicably, Sarah. Legal battles can be so draining. After they left, the farmhouse felt violated somehow, the peaceful atmosphere they'd cultivated shattered by the intrusion of Sarah's past. I swear I didn't know about this, Sarah said, her voice shaking with emotion. Tom kept so many secrets from me about his business dealings, but this feels wrong. Ethan placed a steady hand on her shoulder. I believe you. And we'll figure this out together. In the days that followed, they made the long drive to Billings to consult with a lawyer, a practical woman named Julia Bennett, who listened to their story with careful attention. The document looks legitimate at first glance, Julia admitted after examining the loan agreement. But something doesn't add up. If your husband was in such financial trouble, why would Richard lend him more money? And why wait until now to collect? Richard always had ulterior motives, Sarah explained. He and Tom were partners in several ventures, but Richard was the one with the money and connections. He liked having Tom in his debt. It gave him control. Julia tapped her pen thoughtfully against her desk. And now he might be trying to gain control over you, or more specifically over your new life and property. The insight struck Sarah with chilling clarity. Richard had always resented her influence over Tom, her cautious approach to business, that sometimes countered his riskier proposals. What can we do? Ethan asked. We don't have that kind of money, and I won't risk losing the ranch. First, we need to verify the authenticity of this document, Julia advised. The signature could be forged, or the document could have been altered. Second, we need to search for evidence of repayment. Even if the loan was real, it might have already been settled. It was a long shot, but it was all they had. That night, back at the ranch, Sarah and Ethan emptied out the boxes of Tom's papers that she had brought with her, financial records, correspondence, bank statements spanning years. I went through all of this after he passed, Sarah said, frustration evident in her voice. There was no mention of a loan from Richard. We'll look again, Ethan said firmly. 4 eyes are better than 2. They worked through the night, sorting documents chronologically, cross-referencing bank statements with correspondence. As dawn broke, Ethan found something, a letter from Tom to Richard, dated just weeks before Tom's passing. Sarah, look at this, he said, holding up the faded paper. The letter was brief but clear. Richard, enclosed, is the final payment for the personal loan. As discussed, this settles our arrangement in full. Please send confirmation of receipt. There's no indication he ever sent money with this, Sarah said, hope and doubt warring in her voice. It could have been a draft he never sent. But Ethan was already reaching for a bank statement from the same period. Here, he said, pointing to a withdrawal of $25,000, a significant sum that Sarah had always assumed was related to one of Tom's business ventures. And look at the date. The withdrawal matched the date on the letter. It was circumstantial, but it was something. Further digging revealed more, a pattern of payments that could have been installments on the loan, and most crucially, a brief note from Richard himself. Payment received. Account settled. The note was tucked inside a birthday card Richard had sent Tom almost as an afterthought. He knew, Sarah whispered, anger replacing her fear. He knew Tom had paid him back. This whole thing is a fraud. Ethan squeezed her hand. Now we just need to prove it. The confrontation took place not at their home but on their terms, in Julia Bennett's office in Billings. Richard arrived with his attorney, his confidence evident in his relaxed posture and smug smile. That smile faltered when Julia presented the evidence they had gathered, the letter, the bank statements, and most damning of all, Richard's own acknowledgement of payment. This proves nothing, Richard's attorney argued. That note could refer to any number of transactions between the partners. Perhaps, Julia conceded, but it casts sufficient doubt on your claim to make a judge take notice. And then there's the matter of the signature on your loan document. She produced an expert analysis, questioning the authenticity of Tom's signature, noting subtle discrepancies compared to verified examples. Are you accusing my client of forgery? Richard's attorney demanded. I'm simply presenting inconsistencies, Julia replied calmly. Inconsistencies that would merit a full forensic investigation if this goes to court. The threat was clear. Richard's scheme was unraveling, and a legal battle would risk exposing not just this fraud but potentially others. After a tense standoff, Richard finally spoke. Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding. So it's possible this debt was settled and the records misplaced. It wasn't an admission of guilt, but it was a retreat. By the end of the meeting, Richard had agreed to sign a statement acknowledging that any debts owed by Thomas Matthews had been fully satisfied. As they drove home, the weight that had been pressing on them for weeks finally lifted. Snow began to fall gently, covering the landscape in a fresh blanket of white. We did it, Sarah said softly. Together. Ethan reached across the truck seat to take her hand. That's how we do everything now. When they reached the ranch, they stood for a moment looking at the property, the home they had built together, now secure from the shadows of Sarah's past. I think we should rename the ranch, Ethan suggested. Something that represents both of us. Sarah smiled, feeling a profound sense of belonging. I'd like that. The next day they painted a new sign to hang at the entrance to their property, New Horizon Ranch. It wasn't just a name, it was a declaration. The past had been faced and overcome. The future, stretching before them like the vast Montana sky, was theirs to shape together. Spring came to New Horizon Ranch with a burst of renewal. The pastures turned emerald green, wildflowers dotted the landscape, and the sheep grazed contentedly under the watchful eye of their caretakers. But the most significant new beginning was growing inside Sarah, a discovery that had filled both her and Ethan with equal parts joy and trepidation. Are you comfortable? Ethan asked, adjusting pillows behind Sarah as she sat on the porch swing. At 42, her pregnancy was considered high risk, and Ethan had become protectively attentive. I'm fine, she assured him with a smile. The baby and I are both perfectly fine. Ethan placed a gentle hand on her slightly rounded belly. I never thought I'd be a father, he said quietly. Never thought I'd have the chance. You're going to be wonderful at it, Sarah told him. You have so much love to give. Their peaceful moment was interrupted by the sound of a car coming up the drive, these days a less ominous occurrence. Since their confrontation with Richard, they had gradually become more connected to the surrounding community. The visitor today was Lindsay Carter, a young attorney who had recently moved to the area. Sorry to drop by unannounced, Lindsay said as she approached the porch, but I was hoping to discuss something with you both. Over coffee at the kitchen table, Lindsay explained her purpose. She had heard about Sarah and Ethan's legal battle through Julia Bennett, who had mentored her in law school. What you went through, having to fight so hard for justice without resources or connections, it happens all too often in rural communities, Lindsay explained passionately. Especially to women who are trying to stand on their own. Sarah nodded, understanding all too well. I've been thinking about starting a legal aid service, Lindsay continued. Something accessible to people who can't afford traditional representation. After hearing your story, I wondered if you might be interested in being part of it. Us? Ethan looked surprised. We're not lawyers. No, but you have experience, real-world knowledge that would be invaluable. Lindsay leaned forward eagerly. Sarah, Julia mentioned your financial acumen and attention to detail. And Ethan, your standing in the community could help reach people who might otherwise be hesitant to seek legal help. The proposal was unexpected but intriguing. After Lindsay left, promising to return with more detailed plans, Sarah and Ethan discussed the possibility. It would be a commitment, Sarah acknowledged. But think of the difference it could make. Ethan considered this. My father always kept to himself, never got involved in community matters. I followed his example without questioning it. But maybe there's a better way. The decision to partner with Lindsay in establishing the Mountain Valley Legal Aid Center was the beginning of a new chapter for them both. They converted a small outbuilding on their property into an office space, and word gradually spread throughout the county. Their first case came in the form of Rebecca Jensen, a young woman who had inherited her family's farm after her father's passing, only to face challenges from male relatives who believed she couldn't manage it alone. They're trying to force me to sell, Rebecca explained, fighting back tears. They say a woman can't run a cattle operation, that I'll run it into the ground. But that farm is everything to me. Sarah recognized the doubt and fear in Rebecca's eyes, the same emotions she had battled after Tom's passing. What they're really saying is that they don't think you're capable of making your own decisions. With Lindsay's legal expertise, Sarah's financial guidance, and Ethan's practical knowledge of agricultural operations, they built a case that proved Rebecca's competence. They documented her management decisions, created financial projections showing the farm's viability under her leadership, and gathered testimonials from neighboring ranchers who had witnessed her capabilities firsthand. The case never made it to court. Faced with the overwhelming evidence of Rebecca's competence, her relatives backed down. The victory, though small in the grand scheme of things, represented something powerful, a shift in the community's perception of what was possible. Word spread, and more cases followed. A widow negotiating mineral rights on her property, a single mother fighting for fair division of a family business, a young couple facing predatory lending practices on their first home purchase. Each case was different, but the underlying principle remained the same: empowering people to stand up for themselves with knowledge and support. The Legal Aid Center operated on a sliding scale, with clients paying what they could afford, sometimes in cash, sometimes in trade. A repaired fence here, a delivery of fresh produce there. It wasn't a conventional business model, but it worked for the community they served. As Sarah's pregnancy progressed, she found herself mentoring other women, sharing the wisdom she had gained through her own struggles. Ethan, meanwhile, discovered a talent for mediation, his straightforward manner and innate fairness making him an effective bridge between opposing parties. You've created something remarkable here, Lindsay told them one evening as they reviewed the center's growing caseload. It's more than legal aid, it's changing the culture. Sarah placed a hand on her now prominent belly. We're building the world we want our child to grow up in. The summer months brought new challenges. Richard Harrington, still smarting from his defeat, attempted to undermine their reputation in the business community. Rumors circulated about the legitimacy of their operation, and subtle pressure was applied to potential clients. He doesn't give up easily, Sarah observed when they lost a client who had suddenly withdrawn after a meeting in Billings. Neither do we, Ethan replied, his voice containing a determination that would have been unimaginable to the solitary man Sarah had met during that storm a year ago. Their response wasn't confrontational, but strategic. Lindsay filed a formal ethics complaint documenting Richard's attempt to interfere with legal representation. Sarah reached out to business contacts from her previous life, who still held influence. Ethan leveraged his growing connections in the agricultural community to counter the Whisper campaign. The conflict came to a head when Richard made a final, desperate move, approaching them directly with a proposition. "I'm willing to let bygones be bygones," he offered, looking distinctly uncomfortable in the modest office of the Legal Aid Center. "In fact, I'd like to make a substantial donation to your charity here in exchange for your discretion regarding our previous misunderstanding." What he was really offering was clear, a bribe to buy their silence and rehabilitate his image. "That's very generous," Sarah replied, her tone neutral. "But we're not a charity, Richard. We're a legitimate legal service with ethical obligations to our clients. And our records are open to audit at any time, Lindsay added pointedly. Richard's expression hardened. You're making a mistake. I could be a powerful ally. We've already made our choice about the kind of allies we want, Ethan said firmly, and the kind of example we want to set. After Richard left, his offer rejected, there was a moment of quiet reflection among the three partners. He'll probably keep trying to cause trouble, Lindsay warned. Probably, Sarah agreed, but we've dealt with worse, and we're not alone anymore. As summer turned to fall, the confrontation with Richard faded into the background of their increasingly busy lives. The Legal Aid Center continued to grow, with Lindsay taking on a law school classmate as a partner to help manage the caseload. Sarah and Ethan focused on preparing for the baby's arrival, converting a spare room into a nursery filled with handmade furniture crafted by Ethan and soft blankets knitted by Sarah. The birth of their daughter, Emma Grace Cole, in late September, changed everything and nothing. The core of who they were, individually and as a couple, remained the same. But now their purpose had an even deeper dimension. She has your eyes, Sarah whispered, as they gazed at their newborn daughter in the quiet of the hospital room. And your strength, Ethan replied, his voice thick with emotion. Look at how tightly she holds on. The network they had built proved invaluable during those early weeks of parenthood. Clients became friends who dropped off meals or offered to watch the baby so Sarah could shower. The community that had once seemed so distant now wrapped around them like a protective embrace. By Emma's 3-month milestone, Sarah was ready to return to part-time work at the center. They created a small, safe space for the baby in the office, allowing Sarah to nurse and care for Emma while still contributing her expertise. One crisp December afternoon, as the first snow of the season began to fall, a local newspaper reporter came to interview them about the impact of the Mountain Valley Legal Aid Center. What had begun as a simple profile piece evolved into a feature story about rural justice and community transformation. What made you decide to open your lives this way? The reporter asked. Most people in your situation would have focused solely on their own security. Ethan and Sarah exchanged glances, a year's worth of shared experiences passing between them in that look. We realized that true security doesn't come from isolation, Sarah answered thoughtfully. It comes from connection, from building something larger than yourself, and from recognizing that your story might help someone else write a better ending to theirs, Ethan added, surprising himself with the eloquence that now came more naturally to him. As the reporter left, promising to send them a copy of the article when it was published, Sarah stood at the window with Emma in her arms, watching the snow transform the landscape. Look, Emma, she whispered to her daughter. This is your home. This is your legacy. Ethan joined them, his arm encircling them both. Together they gazed out at the ranch, at the sheep in the pasture, the barn with its new roof, the small office where they helped others find their voice, and the mountains beyond that had once seemed to mark the boundaries of Ethan's solitary world. Not bad for a chance encounter during a storm, he said softly. Sarah leaned into his embrace. I don't believe it was chance, she replied. I think some storms come precisely when we need them, to blow us toward the future we're meant to find. Emma cooed softly, as if in agreement, her tiny hand reaching up to touch her father's face. In that perfect moment, the past with all its struggles seemed to fall away. What remained was the present, rich with love and purpose, and the future they continued to build together, storm by storm, day by day. Dear listeners, we hope the journey of Sarah and Ethan at New Horizon Ranch has touched your hearts. Their story reminds us that sometimes life's unexpected detours lead us exactly where we need to be. For more heartwarming tales of resilience, love, and new beginnings, we've created a special playlist you can find by clicking to the left. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and leave a like on this video. Every day we bring you authentic stories that explore life's complexities and celebrate the human spirit. Don't miss our upcoming content, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What unexpected storm changed the course of your life?